I have an interesting stitch for you to try today. It involves an automatic action of the machine plus hand manipulated lace. This is something I came up with because a friend showed an interesting looking punch card and swatch in one of the knitting groups I participate in, but it was a 12-stitch punch card and had no instructions whatsoever, and we were trying to figure out if it could be done on a modern punch card machine with 24 stitches and what would happen. We really weren't sure what kind of a stitch it was, so I spent an entire day fooling with it, and here is what I've come up with. Initially, I thought it would be pretty for a skirt, and while that is true, it is quite a labor-intense stitch. I don't see myself making a skirt out of it. So instead, I've come up with a pattern for a cowl and or a scootie so that the project is a manageable size. And this will be in Country Knitting and Maine News and Views magazine shortly, probably this winter. The job that the punch card and the carriage do to help us along is to create slip stitch. So this is what the back of the fabric looks like, and it could be easily snagged. Therefore, I suggest lining this fabric. I'm using stretch corduroy here. You could also repurpose a white t-shirt to make a lining, and that would give a nice contrasting background so that your lace would show up better than mine does. But if you can believe it, I didn't have a white t-shirt I was willing to sacrifice. For this cowl and scootie, the design includes sewing the lining by hand a bit inside the parameters of the knitted piece, respecting the pleating, and letting the fabric edge roll right around the lining to finish it up. This will work on Singer Studio Silver Reed, Brother, and Peasel, Knit King, Toyota machines, all the 24-stitch Japanese punch card machines. What I'm showing you here is the various ways to get slip stitch and the card advancing properly on the two machines that I'll demonstrate on. One is a Studio 740, one is a Brother 260. We start with the card locked on the first row, set the length to the normal length and the normal pace of card advancing. Then after a setup row, when we're ready to knit the pattern, we set the card to advance and the slip stitch settings. And by the way, this will also work on a 12-stitch machine. I'll tell you how to punch that card too. We start with a card that looks like this. The arrows mark columns that are completely punched out. The card is actually a 12-stitch repeat that is done twice across a 24-stitch punch card. So if you have a 12-stitch machine, you can just do it once and get the same effect. Going up the card, down the length of the card, it's actually just 2 rows that repeat over and over until you have enough to clip the card together. So start punching the card by drawing the design in carefully. And then I found that after doing about the amount that I have marked on the card, it was easy enough to memorize and predict what should be punched out that I didn't have to draw the entire length of the card. It's really a very simple pattern, and it will work for any 24-stitch punch card machine. The ones that are most common are the Singer Studio batch, the Brother Knit King batch, and the Toyota Elma batch. The only difference between the machines is what row they start on, and I have another video that helps you understand how to make any card work on any of those machines just by knowing where to start. Once the card is complete, or you think it is, I find that checking by flipping it over and laying it on a dark surface is a good visual help. As you join me, I have just made a set of transfers, and the empty needles were pushed back while I did the transfers, but now I'm putting them back into work, and we're going to knit 6 rows. I did the transfers every 4 rows for part of my experimentation and every 6 for other parts, and you can experiment with that and other row counts for different effects. Eventually, the empty needles will pick up yarn and start knitting again, but it may not be the first row because of slip stitch on alternate rows. After the second row, all the needles should again have a strand of yarn on them. On the card, there are 2 continuous vertical columns of stitches all by themselves. Here they are in the fabric. After knitting however many rows, when we work the transfers, we move 5 stitches away from those single columns and towards the center of the triple column. Here's one triple column. At first glance, this looks like a double column of vertical punch-outs by itself. And this looks like it's a single by itself. But when you consider the repeat of the punch card, they actually form another triple column. On the fabric, the arrow is pointing to a single column, and we move the stitches away from it. And the finger is pointing to the center stitch of the triple column, and we move stitches onto it. It's very helpful to have a 5-stitch transfer tool. If you do not, though, you can use a 3 and a 2 and make a 2-stage transfer. Here I'm moving the 5 stitches that are to the right of one of the single columns over to the center stitch of the triple vertical column of stitches. That means we are moving the left stitch from that triple column of vertical stitches along with 4 others. Then on the other side of the center stitch of the triple column, we move 5 towards the center. So you end up with 3 stitches on what was the center stitch of the triple column and empty spaces on each side of the single column. Then we're moving over to the next single column and repeating the operation. This, of course, places 3 stitches together after the transfers on the center stitch of the 3-stitch plain knitting columns. What that means while you're knitting is that you need to be very careful that your stitch size is perfect so that all 3 of those will knit off, and a little extra weight may help as well. Even so, the first row after the transfers, it's a good idea to knit it slowly and check after the row has been knitted, because you can always manually help those stitches if they failed to knit off, and if they did, it's going to mess up the pattern. After all of the transfers have been made, check that all the needles did return to work, the ones we emptied, because they need to start knitting again, and knit the next rows. I always check and make sure that everybody did knit off, which you saw me doing just there. Then knit the decided upon number of rows and transfer again. This sample was done on the Brother 260, and you'll see me knitting part of it next. The techniques in play will work on any gauge of Brother. You'll just get the smaller standard gauge fabric if you use the standard gauge one. I began and ended this cowl with ribbing set up like this, with the 2 end stitches on the main bed at each end. This stitch knits most successfully, especially on Brothers with a substantial amount of weight. So I am showing you what I used. In fact, these are all weights from my book, Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools. So in case it interests you, I will put a link to that book in the program notes. But use any combination of weights you have as long as they're effective. At this point in the video, I'm going to stop doing voiceovers, which I normally do, so that I have better control over the sound and how well you can hear. But I really need to speak as I'm working to make sure that I don't miss anything from here on out. So be aware that you might need to turn your sound up a little bit. We're going to do the same pattern on the Brother machine with a couple of necessary changes in technique. First of all, I'm knitting a scarf. So before knitting each row, I'm going to make sure that the 3 needles on each side are in the forward position. because those needles that are in the forward position will knit, and we don't want to extend our pattern through to the edge. We want to create a nice edge. So this is the only time that you may see me say it, but prior to knitting each row, we move these needles forward if they are not selected to be forward by the machine. As you know, a brother pre-selects for the next row. So those needles that are forward will knit, and those needles that are back will slip. The first little bit of the knitting, you really have to concentrate to see where the single columns of vertical stitches are and the triple columns. Now it's becoming pretty obvious. This column of stitches has always knitted. These 3 columns have always knitted. And you can even see where I've done some transferring to help you sight along it. So we continue the pattern, but we're not working at either edge. So this is the center stitch of the group of 3 that always knits, the 3 vertical columns. We want to move this over here. The outer stitch of the 3, the right-hand stitch, moves left. So do the next 4 stitches. So we're going to move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they'll be moving away from this single column. But with the brother, because it pre-selects the row, we also have to first count the 5 and see what the position they are in, so as to be able to restore them to that position once our transfers are done. In this case, all of these 5 are in the forward position, so they are scheduled to knit next row, and we return them to the forward position, so they will obey the card and do that. Over here, this is the single that we're going to move away from. This is the center of the triple. Here's the single that we're going to move away from, so it'll end up with an eyelet next to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the stitches that will move one place over. This is the center stitch that will receive a second stitch. But we have to pay attention. Only this needle is in forward position. So we'll do the transfers. There are the first 3. And of course, the receiving needle was also in forward position. This is numbers 4 and 5. And these return to forward position, so they will knit next row. Now we need to transfer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 this way. They're all in forward position, so that's pretty straightforward and clear. It's okay to move the needle back because it's easier to get it to receive the stitch in its normal position, or so I think, as long as you remember to then move it forward. And I happen to know that when it's in the correct position, there should be 8 in a row that are forward, so that's a way of double checking. This is a single column of stitches that always knits, so the next 5, these 3, these 2, move away from it and towards the center stitch in the next batch of 3, and only the first of the needles next to the center stitch was in forward position, so that's the one we return to forward position. Everything is as it should be. The end needles are set up to knit. Let's do 6 rows. 1, bring these forward. 2, bring these forward. 3, Bring these forward. 4. Bring these forward. 5. Bring these forward. 6. Bring these forward. This is the center of a group of 3 that always knits, but on the edge we are not moving towards it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll go that way. This is the single that always knits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll go that way, and we'll return this needle to working position. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll go that way. All these come to the forward working position. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That way. Only these stay in what would normally be working position, but is slip position for this card. This one comes forward, and on we go. It's some work, but it's a beauty of a stitch. These patterns will be available to you shortly, and I'm sure you can think of plenty of things to do with the stitch on your own. Have fun!